Next, we have a very special guest amongst us, and not a special guest, but also the chief guest of today's ceremony, Professor Dr. Ashutosh Sharma, Secretary Ministry of Science and Technology, Government of India, from New Delhi, India. I now request Honorable Sir to kindly take over the session and address the gathering.
Thank you. I'm delighted that we are talking about three compelling themes of the future today together. So these are computing, power, and communication. So this is really, really great, and I should congratulate IEEE and Galgotia University, led by the very able leadership of Dr. Dhruv Galgotia and Dr. Preeti Bajaj for making it possible, and Dr. Saad, who gave a very nice introduction to the conference. Uh, so computing, power, and communication are really the pillars of what we are going to be seeing increasingly in the future. Of course, we have been seeing it for a long time, but it's about the convergence of these three technologies that would produce things which are disruptive, which are would bring in unprecedented changes. My delight and my congratulations for getting so many people together to talk about these things. Um, Long after COVID-19 has disappeared from the margins of history books, we would still have overarching challenges. These overarching challenges, and a whole lot of it is about science and technology. It's about sustainable development. It's about healthcare that could reach to the last citizen anywhere, any corner of the world. It is about the rise of intelligent machines, which is going to have huge impact on our skills, on our education, on our jobs, on everything that we do. So it's really, really great. So the future, if you would, is all about the convergence of technologies. You would see that I'm not going to be talking about the technical aspects of this conference because I'm not an expert in it. I'm just a lowly chemical engineer who works in nanotechnology. So let me try to give some insights, a view from if you were to go 30 miles above Earth, if you would, to think together about what kind of future that we would be building and what is the role of these computing power and communication technologies together in it to make a better world. We talk about climate change, we talk about sustainable development, we talk about the affordable and pervasive healthcare. We talk about the rise of intelligent machines, Industry 4.0, Society 5.0, and clearly the science and technology is a strong pillar, but not the only pillar because that has to be integrated with policy measures. It has to be integrated with the regulation, and foremost, it has to be integrated with the will of people. So until the last person in the society is on board, these are the problems you could not address only by science and technology. This is very important for all of us to understand. Even if I am a scientist, I have certain amount of responsibility to take that message of science to different stakeholders in the society that would make it possible. Now, today, this becomes, today, let me also recall that it's the 151st birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. Now, we may not see any relevance of that now in today's world, but actually there is. Because let me very quickly recall the historical lessons. The industry zero was all about the muscle, the brute force, and might is right. So it was controlled as a feudal societies would be controlled only by how much muscle you had. Basically, it was the days of barbarians. Industry one changed a lot of that. Industry one was based on steam power, but that basically meant that everything, the activities that we did was centralized. So you had big factories that are run by steam power, and so therefore there was a very tight control, both of state and small groups on the means of production. Um, so this was the time actually Gandhi was born. So Gandhi was looking at the impact, the lights and shadows of the technology of Industry 1.0. And of course, for much of the part of the world which did not have Industry 1 tools, for example, a whole lot of colonial world mostly saw the shadows of technology. It was only much later that when the technology became more pervasive, that different societies start to feel the impact of Industry 1 and the light that it offered. Industry 2.0 started with the rise of electrical power, and that's one of the things we are discussing here. Electrical power, which made it possible for little things to be in our homes. So the production was no longer centralized, and the consumption also was no longer centralized. And so we could deal with electricity, power, everybody, and that is what actually made possible as a foundation to be who we are today. So Industry 2.0 based on producing power, mostly coal-based, and therefore producing a lot of environmental damage and so on, and leading up to what we see today in terms of climate challenges. Industry 3.0 is something we have seen in our lifetime, right, with the rise of digital, passive digital, which means that I got something in my pocket and I got something in my hand, and that gives me unprecedented communication, and it gives me some computing, which is right here in my pocket as well, and the rise of internet and the rise of all the other computing tools, supercomputers going forward, and so on. Uh, Industry 3.0, which is what I call passive digital cyber, if you would. I call it passive because it's still controlled by me. In a sense, it's not really part of me. It's a little bit out there, but I can leverage it in many, unprecedented ways for doing my computing, doing my communication and stuff. I remember when I was just before I was an undergrad, starting in the mid 70s. Before that, there was a thing called slide rule. My father, who was an engineer, he worked with slide rule, right? So that was before, if you would, Industry 3.0, and what a huge impact that it has really had for our young people today in our classrooms. They absolutely cannot understand the world that you lived in the 50s until 50s, 60s, and so on, which is as well. Now we are into Industry 4.0. Up to an Industry 3, things are controlled by the flow of materials and the flow of energy, especially in the form of fossil fuel energy. Industry 4.0 is controlled by the flow of data, information, and knowledge. So we must add to it the controlling and understanding the flow of materials and flow of energy. We add to it another compelling dimension, which controls everything else. So it doesn't matter if it's material, anything physical, basically is down towards the bottom of the pyramid, if you would, of knowledge. Starting from measurements to data, to information, to knowledge, and hopefully going forward in the future, some amount of wisdom that you would distill from information. Because information and data management has become a huge problem today. In fact, when I was doing PhD, and many of the people here, our distinguished speakers, we remember reading maybe 3 journals in the hard copy, and that pretty much told us actually what we needed to know. Not anymore today. So what that means is that there is an explosion, an exponential growth of information, especially if not knowledge. So it produces a great deal of stress in resolving this paradox about overly burdened system of information, data, measurements, and some amount of knowledge. And how do you actually get something useful out of it? And so I'm sure that going forward in the future, the whole the business of scientific publishing is going to undergo very fundamental changes about how we do research, how do we publish it, how do we access it, and how do we make sense out of it. So clearly here, even artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of that is going to have a huge impact in all of these aspects. But let me not get carried away by that, which is a very interesting and fascinating subject to discuss. By saying, okay, let's conclude this by saying here we are in Industry 4.0, which is all about the convergence of technologies. So while we worked in silos, I always said I was a chemical engineer, I was a nanotechnologist, or whoever, and people said that they were physical chemist and organic chemist and what have you. All of that is making less and less sense going forward. This may make sense for undergraduate teaching, but it's not going to make sense for solving problems. So really, we are looking at two layered structure of knowledge today. One which is undergrad teaching, and the other which is what we call research, but no longer a research which is totally compartmentalized in silos. So, what is this convergence? Well, it's the convergence of physical and cyber. So materials, now you call them smart materials, advanced materials, you call them stimuli responsive materials, call them what you want, it doesn't really matter. And I'm sure going forward in the future, we will have conscious materials. So, we'll have a lot more ConMet conferences, if you would, right, and all of that. But materials, mechanisms, devices, communication, perception in the form of sensors, computing, autonomous decision making, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning, and autonomous action, which is all sorts of actuators. So it's basically a bundle of these things, which is going to be more, it's becoming more pervasive, but it's going to become more personal, which means no longer passive. And going forward in the future, if you were to look at the contours of Industry 5.0, whenever that comes, people often ask that question, okay, what after Industry 4.0, even though we have not exhausted the possibilities of Industry 4.0, but it's good to think about future a little bit to be prepared for it. Industry 5.0, I hypothesize that it would be a convergence of biological with cyber and physical and digital. So the last frontier, if you would, is integrating life and biology into all the things that we considered external to ourselves. And there are great strides being made as we talk about this. The very bold and courageous future, if you would. But anyway, that's you should have another IEEE conference on that, right? Because it's so simply fascinating. I'll just very quickly tell you about what Department of Science and Technology in India is doing about these things. Even though I recognize fully that this is a global conference, but just to give you some hints, we started a program in cyber physical systems last year. It's worth about $500 million, and if you factor in purchase power parity, then it's closer to $1.5 billion, which is setting up different hubs in all the stuff that is robotics, is data, is IoT, is machine learning, whole lot of different things, and their applications in different sectors like health, education, transport, energy, water networks, and all of that, all the usual suspects. Then there's another mission in offering now in couple of months, which is worth more than $1 billion, which is on quantum technologies. So quantum technologies, of course, not only about quantum computing, which is still some way off, and I'm, to tell you the truth, not so greatly optimistic about that. Of course, it's going to generate some new knowledge. It's going to generate very good fundamental new knowledge. But going even forward, quantum communication certainly is a low-hanging fruit. Quantum algorithms, quantum cryptography, quantum devices, quantum sensors, and what have you. So this is a really brave new world in there. Another mission coming up is electric mobility and electric storage, because there's a greater emphasis on renewables. India has a big commitment on renewables, especially wind and solar power. A whole lot of it is photovoltaics. But what that means is that you need smart grids, and so that's related to power. But smart grids and microgrids, because there are a whole lot of places in Himalayas, in Northeast, whole lot of places which are not connected to a main grid. So that if we were to use renewables there, a microgrid would actually empower them. And can you hear me? Just nod your head. Okay, wonderful, because there was a little bit of fluctuation here, it seemed to me, on bandwidth. Okay. It feels very odd if you just go on talking and you are really off the grid, right? And then you say, hey, what's going on here? Okay, so so these things are of great interest to us. We have set up big missions on things like smart grid, the off grid homes, but and there's also a whole lot of international collaboration which is going on in this, especially with the US and UK are the two names that come to my mind, looking at a whole lot of things related to power. Now, another mission, which is a supercomputing mission, which is related to your computing aspects. Now, about first 10 supercomputers, petaflop range, have been assembled in India. Next phase is to design the chip. Of course, we do not manufacture chips, but you can have a good architecture and all the rest of it, on the board level and integration. At the same time, we are putting in research programs in exascale computing, both in terms of architecture as well as in terms of the applications. So you have to produce a large number of scientists who would be able to use these resources. And of course, the storage, which is grid wide. That's a huge, huge challenge. And how do you do it with a sustainable way? Finally, if you were to do the life cycle analysis of renewables, if you would take into account the storage, taking into account the death of panels and their recycle and so on, then you really have to compute about what is the net worth of the clean energy. It may not look as attractive as it does if you only look at the production aspect, for example. It's still better, but one has to do this very deep analysis about the life cycle analysis and the nexus aspect of it. Everything in the world today cannot be viewed in isolation, so it's all about nexus. So when we talk about agriculture, we talk about water. When we talk about water, we talk about energy and power. When we talk about any of this, we talk about communication, we talk about computing in terms of IoT and controls and everything that goes in there. I'll give you an example of the convergence of technologies. We know that cleaning up river Ganga is a big deal. That everybody wants it. How do you actually real time have a map of pollutants going down Ganga and where they are coming from? So you cannot have any interventions unless you know very clearly the point sources, the distributed sources, where does it come, where does it go, what happens to it. So we're working on making these smart pebbles. This is a very nice program, consortium program with about 3 or 4 US universities and equal number of Indian universities and industry, and Intel is a 50-50 partner in it. It's basically about making these smart pebbles, small chips that have onboard sensors, at the same time got onboard power. So you know that, and of course it has to be a chip which consumes very small power, and it must have onboard communication. And you got thousands of these pebbles, tens of thousands of these pebbles distributed all over, and then they are sending all this data, arm load of data somewhere. So this poor back end operation, it has to make use of machine learning to make some sense out of this map of data, which is coming in at faster and faster, just like the future at us, and then make sense and have control strategies and communication strategies. Another very interesting project going on is hyperspectral imaging, which is mounting sensors, of course, on satellites, but also mounting them on drones, so that by measuring different frequency spectrum, you can tell everything about the health of the crop, health of the soil, whether it needs water, does it need fertilizer, does it need to be cut, what have you. Making all these decisions at the right time, at the right speed, would become possible with this. So these technologies are already available, but you have to refine them and put them in practice at large scale. So all of this is going to happen. Anyhow, there was a point was made here that the way we are meeting today, this is about democratization of science. I am so glad. I'm not glad about COVID-19 virus, but I'm glad about some of the changes that it brings. Imagine in the good old days, the good old normal that people want to go back to, and I keep asking them, what part of normal do you want to go back to? I mean, I'm happy with some aspects of it. It saves me a lot of travel. It saves me a whole lot of things. I'm not saying everything is good. So you have to clearly see what new technologies based on computing and communication would become available so that the life going forward in the future becomes simpler. So if you start with the kind of conference we are having, it's completely two-dimensional. I mean, this technology has not changed in the last 15 years, starting from Skype. We are basically Skype people, right? So now, if this were to be so pervasive, we must have some real experience. I mean, in a conference, you want some, experiential things. You want certain kind of experience, and not only this flat two-dimensional experience in which you see three people, right? There's a human, very deep desire in human brain to connect with people, right? And you see, people often ask about what is the right technology for the future. I give them a simple answer. I say, look, examine your desires. Examine the desires of the mind, unfulfilled needs and desires, right? And any technology that would address that would be a big hit. And so we have the example right here. And you can imagine going in the future, we need actually a technology that would put us all together as interactive 3D avatars. If it's a hologram, it doesn't really matter. I'm not talking about the actual technology. I'm only talking about what is needed in order to have an experience which is an interactive avatar, 3D, and sitting in a place that I recognize. And in fact, to be able to see all these people in an auditorium, if you would, and sitting there and talking to them in a virtual, immersive world. So the key points here is immersion in the experience, the reality of experience, and then how do you deliver it to the participants and people. I am sure that there must be breakneck speed work on what we are talking about. I hope that there is. If it is not, then it must start, with the speed and scale, because this is all our future. And so bits and pieces of technologies are available now to be able to do this. But how do you make them so pervasive, so scaled up, and so inexpensive, and so without glitches, right? So this is all about bandwidth of communication. For example, sending data out. 5G is gone some way in that direction, but you would need even faster data rates to have a live experience of that kind. Um, I realize, I think that maybe I've taken longer than was assigned to me. So we should wind it down. Except to say, look, data. I started talking about data, and often I hear people call data the new oil. I think is absolutely wrong. Okay. The thing I think is absolutely wrong is because oil is not that important. And going in the future, it's going to disappear and there's going to be less dependence on oil. Data, on the other hand, is something which is going to be with us forever. So therefore, I propose that data is new water. Okay, you could not live without water, and this is the essence of life, and data actually would be as compelling aspect of our life as water and air. So of course I don't like to call data new air, because air is something people don't really acknowledge its presence, because everywhere it's on demand, everything. So maybe water it is. Um, how we going to make a world using computing, using communication, using power, responsible use of all of these, and evolving them in a direction which leads to a sustainable world. I just leave you with all the younger people. We would not be around to see that world, but a whole lot of younger people who join us today in their teens, in their 20s, in their 30s, they would see a world which is very different. And you have to be fully prepared for this world. And the challenge is, and see what are the new opportunities coming from there. We often accept very easily saying, look, okay, 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise by the end of the century. What does it mean? It means horrible things. It means that your coastal cities like Mumbai, Calcutta, and Chennai would be underwater, that your crops would actually fail, that the food security would be under tremendous stress. Make no mistakes about it. No, it doesn't matter who says what. It's not a lip service. Okay. I've done every possible simulation and the war gaming to see what happens on this. So it is no longer acceptable to simply say, look, by the end of the century, 3 degrees. And what about the next 5 centuries? So the world is not here for 1 century. If that planning is not factored in our culture today, then I'm afraid that our technology has failed us and the world that is going to come. So let's keep in mind as scientists that we also have responsibility not only in our labs, but even outside of our labs, and the society at large, indeed. And so I conclude by saying, of course, I keep saying I conclude, but I really going to conclude now. There's a new science, technology, and innovation policy in India coming up now, 2020. So Science, Technology, Innovation Policy 2020. We are going to factor in very strongly all these aspects about convergence, about connectedness, about how you connect science to society at large, including industry and startups. How do we complete the knowledge chain? You see, it's not about working in silos and isolation anymore to solve problems which are real. Problems of poverty, problems of malnutrition, all of those are scientific problems. They got scientific aspects in them. But we don't recognize it. We don't recognize it because we are not connected. And to how to bring out that connections very strongly is one of the focus areas of the policy. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Bajaj, Dr. Galgotia, Dr. Saad, everybody who joined us today. I am so sorry I did not talk about the science and technology of power. If I knew, I would have. So my apologies about that. And thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you. Namaskar.